Hello, and welcome to the podcast's Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond. We explore historical and spiritual questions about Jesus, gender, women, salvation, healing, and the meaning of life. Shirley Paulson is hosting a series of conversations with scholars who are able to unlock mysteries from extra-canonical books, forgotten scriptures, so-called Gnostic Gospels, and the Bible. And for those of you who love our Bible and Beyond podcasts, would you please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page? Go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to join at any level just right for you. And now, here's Shirley Paulson.
I found another fascinating person to talk to on our Bible and Beyond podcast. I heard Dr. Sarah Parkhouse speaking at the Society of Biblical Literature in November, and as I suspected, she had some exciting things to share in her presentation on the possibility of new information on the Gospel of Mary. For our listeners who already love the Gospel of Mary, I know you'll be eager to hear what Dr. Parkhouse has to tell us. But first, let me tell you a little bit about her. Sarah is a research fellow in the Department of Religion and Theology at the University of Manchester in the UK. She works very broadly on early Christianity, currently exploring Egyptian literature, non-canonical gospels, and martyrdom. Her first book, published in 2019, focused on the Gospel of Mary within the genre of dialogue gospels. After this, she swore never to work on the Gospel of Mary again, but this didn't quite happen. She's beginning another book on this text and is excited to introduce the world to a potential new fragment called Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 5577. Sarah, I think many of us have been very eager for scholars to find the missing parts of the Gospel of Mary, so I was frankly riveted by your presentation, and I'm hoping you can share some of your work with us this afternoon. Why don't you start us off with giving us a brief picture of what the Gospel of Mary is and what's missing?
Great. Thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about the Gospel of Mary and the new fragment. So the first thing I think is important to understand about the Gospel of Mary is that we only have half of the Gospel text, which means that half of it is missing. So the longest version that we have of the Gospel of Mary is from a Coptic codex from late antique Egypt. And the Gospel of Mary runs up to page 19. And we know this because we have page numbers. And we're pretty certain that the Gospel of Mary started on page 1. But the first 6 pages of this codex are missing, and that's a significant amount of text. So the Gospel of Mary starts on page 7. And we start at the end of a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples, and only Peter is named here, so we're not really sure who's included in the group. And they're talking about why Jesus came into the world and what's going to happen. So they talk about matter and how matter was made of various elements and how it's going to dissolve. They also talk about the nature of sin, and it's in this dialogue that we have that quite striking, quite famous saying of Jesus is that sin does not exist. And then the dialogue kind of finishes and Jesus starts a very short farewell monologue in which he gives instructions to the disciples, which are phrases taken from the canonical Gospels, but reworked and reinterpreted. And then Jesus leaves.
That's not nice.
It's not nice. And the nature of the departure is very strange because it just says he departed. So we don't know whether he departed to be crucified. We don't know whether he departed to ascend to heaven, or we don't know if he just left the room. But I think the latter is probably quite unlikely. Because after he departs, the group are weeping and grieving, and they're in agony, and they're really worried about how they're going to follow Jesus's instructions to preach the gospel. And they're really worried about persecution, understandably.
Yeah.
So among all this kind of turmoil, Mary arises, and it just says that she kind of stood up, and we don't know whether she came into the room or whether she had always been there. But here Mary kind of rises to the fore, and she consoles all the disciples, and she reminds them of the Savior, and she says, it's going to be okay, guys. And then Peter says, Mary, we know that you know things about the Saviour. We know that you have been taught things that we haven't been. And it's really important to note at this point that Peter is aware of this. And Mary says, yeah, sure, okay, I'll tell you everything that you don't know. And then she recalls this vision of Jesus. And within this vision, and we don't know whether the vision is after the resurrection, we don't know much about the vision at all. But it starts, and she says to Jesus, hang on a minute, how am I seeing you? Is it through the soul or the spirit or the mind? And Jesus says, it's the mind. And then the text breaks for 4 pages. We have 4 pages missing.
No.
I know, it's awful. So then the text resumes, and we are presumably in Mary's vision, because Mary's recounting a soul journeying through these cosmic powers called darkness and desire and ignorance, and the 7 powers of wrath, which sound terrifying. And then she's explaining how the soul has found heavenly rest by combating these powers. And then she stops speaking, and the text says that Mary stopped speaking because the Saviour had stopped speaking to her. So we're pretty certain that this was all Mary's recollection of the vision. And Peter and Andrew do not like this at all. They are fuming. So Andrew says, Mary, you are making this up. This is heresy. There's no way that Jesus said any of these things. And then Peter says, he attacks Mary on the grounds of her gender, and he says, there's no way that Jesus spoke to a woman and not us. And then they're all kind of arguing. Mary's weeping and saying, I'm not making this up. Please believe me. And then Levi, who's not been mentioned before, stands up and he says, right, calm down, everybody. Jesus loved Mary, so we should listen to her. We should love her. And then he kind of reminds them all of what Jesus said. And then the text ends that they all went out to preach, but we don't know who the they is. We don't know whether it's Peter and Andrew and Mary and Levi are doing something else, or whether it's Mary and Levi and Peter and Andrew are just still fuming in the corner, or we don't know whether it's just the male disciples, or we don't know whether it's all 4 and they're reconciled. So this is another big question about the Gospel of Mary.
So you raise lots of questions, and especially intriguing are those holes in it that we're really curious about. And we obviously have many questions. I just want to ask you one question before we get into that. You said we have this and we have that. Are you implying that there's only one copy of this that we have, meaning the world has?
So we have the Coptic Codex, which I've just basically outlined, the Gospel of Mary in the Coptic Codex. We also have 2 Greek fragments. Okay. But the Greek fragments don't give us any information that the Coptic doesn't. Okay. Yeah.
So the Coptic version has the most information in it. That includes those holes in it.
Yeah.
Okay, so then while you were looking at another ancient fragment recently, you thought it might have some connection with one of these missing parts in the Coptic version of the Gospel of Mary. So I'm interested in how you came across this fragment and what's that about?
So this fragment, as you introduced, is called, it's the Oxyrhynchus papyrus 5577, but we'll call it 5577 for ease.
Okay.
So this has been recently published in the latest volume of the Oxyrhynchus papyri. And for people who don't know what that means, it's there's lots of fragments which were found in the city of Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. This city is a real treasure trove for ancient historians. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny little texts that we can either identify or not.
Okay.
So this fragment was presented at the last Society of New Testament Studies in Vienna last May. Unfortunately, I wasn't there because I was being elected, and you're not allowed to go when you're elected. But I very, very luckily had friends in the room who saw this and thought, Sarah needs to see this. She loves anything to do with Mary texts, any Mary. So the editor of the papyrus, Juan Chapa, was very, very kindly let me see a pre-published version, and we had a really great discussion about it. Should I talk a little bit about the
Well,
fragment itself?
yeah, well, no, I suppose we better get going a little bit more about, just tell us what does the fragment kind of talk about? What's it about?
So it's a tiny fragment. It's about 13 centimeters.
Ooh,
Yeah,
okay.
but the ancient historians are used to working with this, and we do what we can with these things.
Yeah.
So on one side of the fragment, we have an unnamed figure who must be Jesus talking
Okay.
to a character called Mary and teaching her about baptism and divine goodness and the Father and the incarnation and baptism on both sides.
On
Uh,
both
um,
sides. Okay.
yeah. So the text follows on, but we've only got like a little bit, and then we're missing bits, and then we've got another little bit. So we don't even know which way, which bit is first. Um, but a really interesting thing to note about this little fragment is that it directly contradicts the canonical Gospels. It
Oh dear.
quotes, oh dear. So it has a quote from John the Baptist where he says, "I baptize you with water, but a man will come and baptize you with fire and spirit." And Jesus in this text is basically saying, no, Mary, that's not the case. Don't listen to that. In order to be saved, you have to combine water and fire. And then he says, by doing so, you can become an image of light. So basically, go to heaven.
Okay. Well, then, since this fragment isn't all that long, maybe can you give us an English translation of it and the whole little fragment?
Yeah, absolutely. It won't take long.
Okay. Okay, tell us then.
So just to note, it is a fragment. So we start halfway through a sentence. So we
Okay.
start with, "We'll fall on the earth." I'm just going to read this. So, "We'll fall on the earth. John said, I wash you with water, but a man will come and will wash you with fire and spirit. Therefore, I say to you, Mary, seek to combine water and fire. You will no longer appear as an image of flesh, but as an image of the eternal, incorruptible light, bringing together from two intertwined and dissolved elements." And then it kind of breaks away, and we might be able to work out the words intellectual and Mary. Now, on the other side of the fragment, the first sentence is a bit broken, but it says something about the good Father. And then it says possibly the word restores. And then the simple and incorruptible form. Therefore, I say, Mary, I was manifested as artificial mind in flesh, filled with the word of the incorruptible Father, awakening through my goodness the hidden life of the Father. And then it breaks away again, and we might have the word reminder and we might have the word form. So we're talking a seriously small bit of text here.
Yes. Well, then, okay, I heard the word Mary twice on both sides, but I mean, there's lots of Marys out there. What made you think that this might be related to the Gospel of Mary then?
So there's quite a lot of reasons, I'm afraid.
Okay, good.
So firstly, Jesus is talking about these elements, the dissolving elements. And this is exactly what we have at the beginning of the Gospel of Mary, when Jesus is speaking to Peter, among others. And he's talking about, he says, every nature, every form, every creature exists, and with each other will be dissolved again into their own roots. So we have a similar vocabulary, similar themes about intertwined and dissolved elements. And then we have on this fragment these elements in a baptismal context, because he's quoting John the Baptist and he's also talking about a salvation, maybe a method of salvation. And we have some baptismal themes in the Gospel of Mary. Another point is the use of the language of mind, or nous in the Greek and the Coptic. In the Gospel of Mary, the nous is emphasized. Jesus says, for where the nous is, there will be treasure, which is a reworking of a synoptic saying, but which prioritizes the mind. And here he's saying that he is manifested as artificial mind, nous, in flesh. I appreciate that this is quite strange wording, but
Yes.
it's what we have.
Yes.
And then we also have similar language of divine goodness. The Gospel of Mary talks about Jesus being good at 3 points, or it calls Jesus the good. And then the way that the text uses the canonical Gospels, so I've just said about how 5577 contradicts the saying of the Baptist. We also have this in the Gospel of Mary, particularly in Jesus' farewell discourse. He contradicts but uses sayings from the canonical Gospels, particularly around the Son of Man. So in the Gospel of Mary, he says to find the Son of Man within. And so he's taken the kind of apocalyptic Son of Man that's coming on the clouds and telling the disciples, beware, that's false. Like, don't listen to that. So there's a striking amount of correspondences between this tiny little text and what we have in the Gospel of Mary.
So this is just the thing, putting these things together that I had not heard the first time hearing you saying this. We don't see Mary baptized in the Gospel of Mary, though, do we?
In the Gospel of Mary, we definitely don't, no. But then we don't really have any narrative in the Gospel of Mary. We have entrances and departures, but that's it. So we shouldn't expect to see Mary being baptized.
Okay.
But
well, then maybe go ahead.
Okay, but what we do have is very Pauline language about baptism used in the Gospel of Mary. And the Gospel of Mary is quite a Pauline text. And by Pauline, I mean the whole Pauline corpus.
Maybe I should just say that in American accent, we probably hear it more like Pauline.
Oh.
So people will know what you're saying. You're saying that's related to Paul, right?
Yeah.
Pauline. Okay, just want to make sure our listeners hear Pauline or Pauline either way.
I'm surprised I didn't already know that. Okay, Pauline. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So now we're talking about Paul. Go ahead. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So when I was talking about the canonical Pauline letters.
Yes.
So we have Levi at the end of the Gospel saying about putting on the perfect man. And this is echoed throughout the Gospel, where Jesus says to find the Son of Man within. And Mary says that Jesus has made them all man or human. So this is we can say human or man. I say man because people might be more familiar with it from the New Testament.
Yeah, okay.
So these are kind of, all of these refer to the process of the disciples being able to become Christ-like. And this is what we have in early interpretations of Paul and modern interpretations of Paul. Also, the soul's journey might refer to some kind of baptismal ritual.
Oh, okay.
And again, if we look at Paul, we can understand this, because in Ephesians, Paul, or whoever wrote Ephesians, he's talking about a battle with cosmic powers. He's talking about wearing armor of God. And in the 2nd and 3rd century, a lot of early Christian authors understood this to mean baptism. So I'm wondering if the journey of the soul is some kind of initiatory ritual.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, then also another surprising term in there was that you mentioned the reference to the Father. And so, like, what would that mean? Is that related to the way we understand the Father in canonical writings, or is there any significance in the Father here?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that is one of the points where it could radically change the way that we read the Gospel of Mary.
Oh boy. Okay.
Well, not too much, but
okay.
in the identified Gospel of Mary, we have no kind of higher power. We have no Father, we have no God, but we also have no creator.
Okay.
Like good or bad, as in Orthodox or Gnostic. We don't have any of that. So so this is introducing the Father into a text which doesn't already have the Father. But we have to remember, in the first 6 pages, Jesus could have said anything. He could have talked endlessly about the Father in any way. We have no idea what happened.
Yeah.
So I don't think that that's something really to worry about.
Okay.
In terms of what the Father is, I would suggest thinking of the Father in quite a Johannine way here. Because the
and when
Father,
you say Johannine, you're talking about things that relate to the Gospel of John or John type things? Okay. Want to make sure we're with you. Okay.
Yeah, so say at John 1:14, we read that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, I think that idea is here in 5577.
Mm.
We have Jesus as the artificer, which is kind of like a craftsman, a creator role, like a logos role. being filled with the Father. So I think that this quite strongly links to what we have in the Gospel of John.
Wow. So I would love to hear your thoughts on the big picture then of what this might mean if this really is the Gospel of Mary, which I would be excited to have happen. But I also know I have to be cautious about jumping to conclusions.
We
At
all
any
do.
rate, what would that mean? Like, what's the impact of this? How does it change our understanding of the Gospel of Mary itself?
A couple of ways. Some, it just kind of emphasizes what we already know. In some ways, we would have to alter our reading of it. So if this is the Gospel of Mary, it would emphasize Mary's privileged position of the recipient of these teachings. It stresses the link with the canonical Gospels. There's some debate in Gospel of Mary scholarship about whether the Gospel knew the canonical Gospels. If 557 is part of the Gospel of Mary, we know that it did because it's quoting John the Baptist. It's also adding the Father into a text that doesn't already have the Father, and re-emphasizing the goodness of the divine. It's also putting kind of Christ at the center in a way that sometimes we don't think he is in the Gospel of Mary, which isn't what I argue in my work, but I know that others disagree. And it's putting Christ in the center because Jesus is saying that he was manifested as this kind of creative mind in flesh. It's showing that he has this creative role and will also dissolve these elements, which I think is really interesting. It makes it kind of a more Christological text, a more Jesus-focused text. It also encourages this baptismal interpretation, which I've gone some way to explaining, but it would push it a lot more, and particularly the journey of the soul. We normally understand it as a post-mortem ascent, something that happens after you die. But maybe it's something that actually happens through a ritual. So it raises that question.
Could you talk about that a little bit more? What do you mean by, first of all, I think the ascent of the soul is not well known to people who only read the canonical writings, but what do you mean by the ascent of the soul itself? I just think we want to hear a little bit more about that.
So the narrative of the ascent of the soul in the Gospel of Mary. So at the end of Mary's vision, she's talking about a soul which is passing through different levels, which are named as darkness and desire and ignorance. So nasty levels. And then she ascends to what is called rest. So a kind of a heavenly rest. So that's what I mean by the ascent of the soul. Now, most people read it in the Gospel of Mary as something that will happen after they die.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder whether it is actually a way to find salvation on earth. And I kind of wonder this because in 5577, Jesus says that if Mary combines these elements, she'll become this eternal light. And then what happens after she becomes light? She defeats this darkness that we find in this vision.
So, okay, so then you talked about that in terms of a ritual, and I think of rituals as having to do with doing something like a baptism or doing some kind of ceremony. This sounds like it's so kind of cerebral or mental. What kind of ritual are you talking about?
I am talking about a baptism. So I'm thinking more of kind of the metaphorical connotations of a baptism, not something that you can do in the body, but it's how early Christians would have imagined baptism functioned. And we have this in 2nd and 3rd century texts where baptism is understood as a death and a rebirth, or something which allows salvation and rest while still embodied. So it's not too much of a stretch, I think.
Right. Okay. So that's why it could be something that's pre-death, even though we're talking about death and rebirth. It's something that goes on more in your soul than it is with your body.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Right. And so then going back to this fragment, does this sort of help to you think, put the whole story together in terms of the ascent of the soul in particular?
I think it does for me. But if you didn't want to read the ascent of the soul as a baptism, if you wanted to read it as something that happened after death, something more literal,
Mm-hmm.
then it would probably cause some problems.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
I think it raises the questions of whether they're talking about something ritualistic in the Gospel of Mary as opposed to like a literal ascent of the soul after it leaves the body.
Great. Okay. Then you got it. We should probably talk a little bit more about where people will be skeptical about this, because it's exciting if this is possible, but
Yes.
everybody has skepticism about these things. Could you tell us why people might argue back with you about this?
That's such an interesting question. So I think, well, close readers of the text will notice that the name Mary is spelt differently in the identified Greek fragments and 5577. So in 5577, it's spelled as Maria, and in the Greek fragments, it's Mariame. So this raises the question, are we talking about different Marys? Is one the mother and one Mary Magdalene, perhaps, or a different Mary? But I don't think so, because the spelling of the name Mary fluctuated quite a lot in early Christian literature. We have variations even within the same text, like the first Greek manuscript of the famous non-canonical gospel infancy narrative called the Proto-Evangelium of James. We have 3 different spellings of Mary.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair enough. What else would somebody say you can't do that about?
Well, I'm not sure, but I'm sure that people will find their reasons.
Yeah.
But I think the main kind of thing that I'll come up against is that they will say that it's too speculative.
Okay.
And it is speculative.
Yeah.
It's certainly very speculative. I mean, I'm not pretending it's not, but I think it's probable. And at the least, it's definitely worth discussing and raising the question, and also not being afraid of doing so.
Yeah. So going back to the whole question about its value and its worth and all, what would happen if it weren't it? If it was something else, what implications would that have for you then?
I mean, if it
Would
could
that be
be
a
proven
disaster?
Sorry?
I said, would that be a disaster then? What happens?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Nothing's ever that important.
Okay.
No, I think if it was proven one day that it wasn't part of the Gospel of Mary, I think that would be actually really exciting, because it would mean that we have a new kind of gospel-like text, one that focuses on Mary, another one that's being read at Oxyrhynchus, another dialogue gospel, and my book is on dialogue gospel, so I'd be fascinated to find more. And also, we would have a text that has these weird similarities with the Gospel of Mary in a way that other texts don't, and that would be really interesting. But fundamentally, whatever it was that proved that this wasn't the Gospel of Mary would be so exciting in its own right, because it would have to be another part of this text or another part of the Gospel of Mary. So that would close the conversation down, but open such like another one, which would be wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. You sold me then. I won't be so sad if it's not then. Okay. Okay. So another question we might be asking is that you told us that the main Gospel of Mary we're looking at is in Coptic, but this is a Greek fragment. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
So tell us why it could be Greek and not Coptic and still fit together.
Oh, because we have 2 Greek fragments of the Gospel of Mary. So the identified Greek fragments are both late 2nd, early 3rd century. And then this would be another Greek fragment of the Gospel of Mary, maybe, which is dated to the 4th century. So it would mean that it would be continuing to be written in Greek, in Oxyrhynchus, because they're all found in Oxyrhynchus, either before or maybe at the same time that it was being translated into Coptic.
All right. Well, so that doesn't take away the possibility then that it actually fits. Then it fit there just as another fragment.
Yeah, okay. No, it adds to it, because a lot of these Coptic texts we don't have the Greek fragments of.
Right.
So, yeah. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So there's another question I have about this kind of writing, and you said that it sort of contradicts the canonical writings. Do you feel like there are this kind of writing, like there was a whole group of writings that are just meant to be contradictory to the canon, and there's a big fight between the two? Or how do you see these two groups in relation to each other?
That's really interesting. I'm not sure that I would particularly put the canonical writings in a group. I know I've used that phrase today because it's easy, and I've used it in writing because it's easy, and we all know what it means.
Yeah.
But if you look at the canonical Gospels, they're contradicting each other. So they're just rewriting and reinterpreting material that they already have. Whether 5577 is actively in conflict with the synoptics, with the Baptist saying, or whether it's just trying to do something else, we don't know. And we don't have enough of this text to know. I think maybe this text is leaning more towards the Gospel of John than Matthew and Luke, and therefore it wouldn't really mind that it was contradicting Matthew and Luke, because it would be maybe in the tradition of John. But simply with this such a small fragment, it's hard to tell. So I'm just speculating.
Right. Okay. So, and you even had mentioned that the Pauline, which is canonical. So,
Yeah.
So those fit together too. All right. Well, so you left me feeling very excited about all this. Do you have any words of wisdom for those of us who can't wait to hear more about this? Like, what should we look for next? What are you going to do next about this?
So I have an article coming out sometime, I think, in 2024.
Okay.
I haven't been sent anything yet. It will be in the journal called Novum Testamentum, and it's a longer version of what I've said today, with more depth, and we've got the Greek, and there will be longer passages of the Gospel of Mary. So if you're interested, have a look at that. It will be open access, I think. Or just send me an email. I'd love to hear what you think.
And how do people find you? What's your email?
Well, I'm currently at Manchester. So if you just Google Sarah Parkhouse, University of Manchester, you'll find it. But
very good. All right.
Yeah. Email addresses don't always last forever. So just Google.
Well, may the Gospel of Mary last forever.
May more of it be found.
Yes. This has been exciting. I'm just thrilled. I'm happy to let go of the thought that it has to be there to be happy. But I'm willing to see what's coming next. I think this is a wonderful discovery, and I'm glad that you had enough experience with your own work that you could recognize something like this to bring this into conversation. It's been lots of fun talking to you, Sarah. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the great questions.
It's fun. Thanks a lot.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us today. Be sure to check out the details from this episode from the show notes on the website earlychristiantexts.com, or just come browse around on the website to find all the other resources provided for you there. Also, we ask for your support to keep producing these podcast interviews. Please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page at patreon.com/BibleandBeyond. And we love hearing from you on the Facebook page at Early Christian Texts or Twitter at EarlyXIAN Texts. Be sure to come back next month for our next episode on Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond.